So I'd like you to give a very warm welcome to Sir David Attenborough. Sir David.
Thank you very much indeed, Tony. I don't think I need go on at length to an audience like yourselves about the dangers and the perils that face British wildlife. You know that very well. If you didn't, I don't suppose you would be here. Nonetheless, the figures are alarming. 50% of the hedgehog population has disappeared in the last 25 years. That was one of the figures that came from the conference we had exactly a year ago. 50% hedgehogs. Wonderful little creatures. Gone. 90% of the British wildlife, I beg your pardon, 90% of the wildlife meadows have disappeared over the last century. 90%. 60% of wildlife is diminishing and endangered. And 10% of British wildlife species seem almost certain doomed to disappear within the next few years. So I needn't go on about that, and I won't. But what perhaps I might go on about a little is the fact that you, this audience, is not the traditional naturalist audience that I would expect to be talking to 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you would be naturalist to a man. Actually, you are naturalist to a man still, but you are also administrators, businessmen, executives, and people who will have decisions which can affect the future of our wildlife. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, those of us who were concerned about butterflies or birds were a small group, and we were perhaps very self-centered, thinking entirely about our little patch. Now, you, with your wide interests, spanning all parts of the activity in this country, are here concerned about those very subjects. And that in itself is a huge, huge advance. Thank you for that. Once, not so long ago, the arguments in conservation, apart from what was happening to our natural world, was to what extent human beings were responsible. The posh word, was it anthropogenic? The changes that we see in the environment, the rise in the temperature of the sea, of the climate, the increase of CO2 in the air. How far had humanity contributed to these changes? That argument is yesterday's argument. I'm sure that a great number of scientists are absolutely convinced that mankind is involved and was responsible for what is happening, but that is beside the point. It is happening. That is yesterday's argument as to why. Today's argument is how we deal with it, and that's why all you are here now. We know that the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing. It would be amazing if it wasn't, bearing in mind the great increase in human population that there's been over the past century. So it's there, but how can we reduce it? That is the question now, not whether or not we were responsible for it. And so now what is heartening about this community that you are part of is that between you, you have the power to deal with these problems that we are facing us. There are naturalists among you, people with expertise on the various aspects of British wildlife. But there are also executives, as you know, yourselves, people who can take decisions which will really affect wildlife, which naturalists in themselves can't do. People here with the power in their hands to change things. There are politicians here. Hooray! When was it that there was the Deputy Prime Minister who had agreed to come and address a conference like this? That's a huge advantage. But when we contemplate what we're going to do about the problems that face us, let us not take a sentimental, backward view. There's a general view about people who are not involved in conservation, who think that conservationists are harking back to a kind of paradisial interwar landscape with horses pulling ploughs and a kind of past agricultural tradition, which in truth was perhaps not as productive as it is now, but it never really existed as it exists in the minds of many people now. We aren't proposing in conservation that we go trying to go back to the 30s. Those days are past. I mean, for one thing, the size of our population in this country has increased 3 times in the last 50 years, of the world at any rate. World population has gone up 3 times in the last 50 years. So let's not, and we certainly aren't proposing that we go back to a kind of pristine Britain, where there were forests and seashores and mountains unsullied by man. No part of the British countryside, except perhaps a few square yards on the tops of the summits of the Scottish cairngorms, no part has been unaffected by human activity. Our hand is everywhere. We are not living in the Brazilian forest. We are living in a land that bears a huge population, where we live cheek by jowl with the natural world, and have changed it for the past 2,000 years. The question is, what is going to be doing in the next few years? So instead of looking back, we have to be looking forward. What is awaiting us? We know that climate change is happening. There can be no doubt about that. It is, of course, to be regretted from some points of view, but it is also to be embraced. The fact is that climate change is causing great changes in the distribution of the animals and plants, the insects, the mammals, the birds of our countryside. And we have to not only respect that, but take advantage of it and cater for it. It's very important that we should accept that there are things coming in from Europe now, butterflies that we have hardly seen for years are now becoming steadily more commonly seen. Hummingbird hawk moths, which once were a cause of extraordinary surprise by people on the south coast, are now almost common. So we must recognize that these animals and plants are coming in at the same time. Animals and plants that lived in this part of the country are moving north as the climate warms to get those parts of the countryside that now suited them better up farther north where it's cooler. And what does that mean? That means that we ought to be catering when we are thinking about conservation as to how we are going to cater for that requirement to move. We ought to be giving thought to the wildlife corridors that we can provide to make sure that animals, plants can in fact migrate. And instead of naturally thinking that every new arrival is an exotic foreigner that ought to be repelled, we ought to recognize them as our new populations. And that's one of the consequences, or one of the challenges, which is facing naturalist societies in the next few decades. And we also ought to recognize that whereas we thought in 1945 that the way we were going to solve the problems about the natural world was to create wildlife conservation areas, national parks, nature reserves, we now know that is not enough. Those nature reserves are as important as they have ever been, but they are by no means enough. We now know that the whole of the countryside, and indeed a whole of the urban landscape, is available for wildlife, and we should make it more welcoming for wildlife. We should make sure that the suburban gardens, which represent a very significant proportion of the area of this country, are made more and more accessible and more suitable for wild creatures that are native to this country or which are now slowly moving into this country. Roadside verges. The Meadowland movement has been a great and exciting thing, particularly in my part of West London. I see it all the time. There are enlightened areas where once there were those semi-sterile beds of grass or municipal planting. Now there are rich meadows, and I rejoice in them. But that can go much further. So in the future, which is what we are dealing with, not just bemoaning the past, in the future there are great new challenges, and they can be answered by the three things that are represented so abundantly in this group. They are represented by naturalists who can tell you what's happening, who understands what's happening, who understands what the new species are, who understand what their requirements will be. There are politicians, thank goodness, who are here, who can help make sure that the legislation which goes through bears some sort of relationship to what is happening. And there are business executives who, in a myriad of ways, which you will know better than me, you will be able to help and make sure that the businesses which you control take account of what is happening around them and make sure that the practices that you do to produce your products, whatever they may be, are in sympathy with the demands of the natural world. Of course, all this is going to cause problems. It's going to cause trouble. It could even, let it be faced, it could even make things on occasion more expensive. Is that worthwhile? It's the most important decision all of us have to face. The fact of the matter is that we, Homo sapiens, are dependent on the natural world. We are part of the natural world. We depend on the natural world for the air we breathe, for the food we eat. Some people might even say we are dependent upon the natural world and contemplating the natural world for our very sanity. And I'm absolutely convinced that children who are brought up without contact to the natural world will live deprived lives. It is essential for the development of our children that they should have some awareness of the natural world and the way it works. At the moment, I've been involved in trying to help schools develop gardens around the schools and their playground, where children can go pond dipping, where they can look at insects, where they can see the natural world. And of course, when you watch children doing that, it is one of the most moving experiences you can imagine. The delight, the fascination on the face of a 6-year-old when they suddenly look at a pond skater or a caddisfly larva. Those kids develop something which is of extraordinary importance for their own character development. And yet, I have every sympathy with the schools, for they are under greater pressure than they've ever been. There are more people wanting more places than there have ever been. There is more pressure on the playgrounds than there has ever been. There is more danger now to the advances we've made over the past 10 or 15 years in persuading schools to make nature gardens than there has ever been. And those advances are now under stress. How are schools to deal with the problem of providing more spaces, as we know must be done? How is that to happen without losing those little areas which we once thought were so important? So there's a lot ahead, problems ahead that face conferences like this. But those problems have to be grappled with. If they're not, there will be uncertainty, great impoverishment, both physically and intellectually and spiritually, to the members of the population of this country. So what you will be doing in this conference is of great, great importance to a lot of people out there who, while so far be unaware of the things that are concerning you, you can provide the leadership and you can provide the decisions. I wish you every success in your deliberations over the rest of the day. Thank you.